Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I want to welcome everybody here, and particularly John Taylor Gatto, for coming all this way to speak on a topic that Ralph Waldo Emerson said almost forced a yawn on us, which is education. Dorothy Sayers says the reason that all of us, in a sense, have a right to speak about education is because we have all gone through some process of education and, in a sense, miseducation. And she says that the people that didn't learn anything in that process should be the ones we should perhaps listen to most because they have something to tell us about it. And on the way here, as I was driving, I was thinking about my own educational experience. And in some ways, it's probably not dissimilar to a lot of people in this room who have been through American educational institutions. I went to school here in California. I also went to school on the East Coast. And I was thinking on the way, I was thinking about my teachers, because teachers are such interesting figures in our lives. And I was thinking about my first grade teacher, Mrs. Gilmore. I remember her name. I can see her, black hair. She's a very tall, thin lady. And she was almost a classic school marm. The beginning of my problems was in that classroom. And then I remember my second grade teacher, but particularly I remember my third grade teacher, Miss Williams, because there was an event that happened in third grade that had a very deep impact on me, and that was I was falsely accused of something. And I remember the mortified state that I was in when somebody came into the classroom and whispered into her ear, and they both looked at me in front of all these small children. And then the teacher said, "Oh, we don't like boys that do that." And I was completely nonplussed. I didn't know what they were talking about. And I was taken to the principal's office and whacked with a paddle. And this was a complete case of false testimony by one of my arch enemies in the playground. That was my first real taste of injustice, that I was the arbitrary victim of false testimony, and I suffered the consequences. And that taught me something about the nature of justice and injustice, and the sense that people feel when they're wronged, when there's an injury, which is a beautiful word coming from the Latin injuria, unjust. Then I remember going into fourth grade, Mr. Foote, and then in fifth grade, things began to change radically. I had a teacher called Dennis Hasslinger, and this was the beginning of Summerhill. He'd read this, and this was the 1960s and a lot of experimentation, and we moved into a whole other realm of teaching. So I went from these very old school marms to a very radical young man who was dedicated on undoing that damage that had been done, and he did his own damage, unintentionally, obviously. And then sixth grade, Mrs. Johnson, I remember these people so well because I lived with them for a year of my life and listened to them. Eighth grade, I went to an experimental school in Marin County that had 4 quads: earth, wind, fire, and air. And each one of these quads, based on testing, you were put into a quad in order to enhance your natural aptitudes. So I was put into C school, which was for people that were gifted with language, reading and writing. Sun school was for mathematics, and then they actually had Wood school, which was for arts and crafts, hand type things, and then they had a music school. And then something very radical happened. Major disruption in my own education. I went to a prep school on the East Coast and went into deep shock. I'd gone through 8 years of California, and suddenly I was thrust into an institution on the East Coast that was founded in 1789 and was run by Jesuits. It was a very, very difficult experience for me personally, and I remember just having a lot of really difficulty there, dealing with the East Coast children that were very different from the West Coast. There was a lot of bullying And I remember a novel that really impacted me was a novel called Separate Peace. because I lived that experience. And that novel had a major impact on me when I was in ninth grade. And the pain that was inflicted, this recent event of hazing, I think what was so troubling about that, not the hazing's been around in this country for a long, long time, but young girls were doing it. I mean, it's like Chris Rock said, that that this world's upside down when the best rapper is a white guy and the best golfer is a black guy. The same case here, we've got young girls that are hazing brutally. If that's equality, I'm, deeply worried about what we're doing to these girls, because I think that making girls more like men is actually the wrong way to go. It's the other way around. It's actually the men that need to learn how to be more like those natural qualities that women have, mercy and compassion. I mean, this is the humanization process. We don't call our schools alma maters for nothing. The nurturing mother. I mean, that's what a school is supposed to be. It's supposed to give you your humanity. So in looking at my own education, I couldn't take 2 years of that on the East Coast, and then I went to an Augustinian school on the West Coast, which was much easier, and that's the difference probably between the Jesuits and the Augustinians. One's a militant order, and the other is less so. After that, I was down in a junior college in Southern California, and I had a conversion experience. It was a very powerful conversion experience, and I was uninterested in pursuing my college anymore, and I dropped out, and I went overseas, and I spent 3.5 years with a person who I really feel I got my real education with this person. Like one of the things that probably the greatest American novelist, Herman Melville, said, that my college was not Yale or Harvard. My college was a whaling ship. And that really was the college that I went to, was with an individual who was an extraordinary human being. And it was very difficult to be with this person, but at the same time it was incredibly beneficial. And he exposed me to a whole range of thought. I realized in thinking back about my own educational experience, what I learned was rarely in school. I was fortunate to grow up in a house that had a very large library. And I remember very clearly discovering, when I was probably about 13, Guy de Maupassant. And my mother had a very early edition of his short stories, and I read that from cover to cover, and I can really recall those stories to this day. The Necklace, I will never forget that story. And Oscar Wilde, my older brother was interested. I read voraciously the plays, The Importance of Being Earnest, and his short stories, The Happy Prince, and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And I had a deep interest also in the Civil War, and I read Shelby Foote, and an interest in World War II, which a lot of young male Americans, at least when I was growing up, had an interest in that subject. What I remember in school is that I remember so little of it in terms of just what I was taught. I can literally only remember one thing in my entire 7th grade year. I remember the teacher, Mr. Smith, who in the biology class told us it was impossible for Jesus to have been born of virgin birth because men determine sex, and Mary only had an XX chromosome. And that's literally all I remember from 7th grade. Somebody said a gentleman should at least have forgotten Latin, right? So, I mean, that's a problem in education, that you forget. And some say education is what remains after you've forgotten everything else. But when I spent this 3 years with this person, what happened to me next was I got a scholarship to the United Arab Emirates, and I went into an Arab school, and I was literally put in 3rd grade, and I was now 20 years old. I was put in 3rd grade because I did not know Arabic. It was really interesting being in this 3rd grade because, one, I came to really understand the whole problem with the Arab world from that. The Arabians are not unlike the Americans. Most of our problems are in the educational system, and I really do believe that. But the punitive measures that were used in that school, the humiliation, the just horrendous pedagogy that was practiced by these teachers, who inherited the same styles from their prior teachers. And this is what happens. Nietzsche said we recreate ourselves. We just keep giving the next generation the same problems that we too had. But from there, what happened to me was a very profound experience. And that was I discovered West Africans when I was in the United Arab Emirates. And from that discovery, it led to studying with them. And these were some of the most extraordinary people that I've ever met. And I would contest that they are some of the most extraordinary people left on the planet. They were all raised nomads. They had extraordinary educations, prodigious memories. They absorbed massive amounts of information when they were young children. And they mastered what we used to call in this culture the liberal arts. They focused very heavily on grammar, on rhetoric, on logic. And it was very odd to meet West Africans, Bedouin, nomads, who literally were learning traditional logic. These were people that lived in tents, and most of their books were handwritten, that had been written down and passed on through centuries. I mean, really an amazing experience for me. But what struck me most about these people was their presence. It was not simply what they knew, but how that knowledge permeated their experience of life and how it translated into their behavior. And I ended up studying with them and spent several years with this group of people. And even I went from the Emirates, after 4 years with them, I went to Mauritania and lived in the Sahara. When I got to the Sahara, I was just so overwhelmed by a people that basically had no ministry of education, so to speak. They had no school system. They had no salaried teachers. And they had no budgets for books, nothing. And yet these extraordinary schools exist out there. And I think if you actually saw these schools, you would just marvel at their existence. And they have been there for literally centuries. And in studying with them, what I realized was that there are certain techniques in education that have been understood for millennia. And they have very profound impact on the acquisition and the use of knowledge. And one of the things that these people understood very clearly was the difference between information and between knowledge. And they distinguished between those two terms. The idea of people that have a lot of information but don't know how to process that information, don't know how to make it useful for them. And they distinguish between knowledge and between wisdom. And just as our language has different words for these different ideas, their language also reflects that. And I probably would assume that most human languages do. In looking at their educational system and how they taught and how they imparted knowledge, there were certain things that I would like to share with you about that in terms of looking at a classical versus a modern education. And I'm using a West African Arabian model, but I believe that this model could also be found in traditional European and even in traditional American society. Where I think there's a big difference is that in the traditional Arabian sense of it, they really saw the democratic nature of education. There was an idea that everybody was entitled to attempt to learn. And I once read a beautiful legal opinion, what's known as a fatwa, which is a non-binding legal opinion, a beautiful fatwa from a Moroccan scholar, Alwan Sharisi. Educational endowments came from the Muslim world, and they were introduced into the West through the Muslim world, which has been very well documented by George Makdisi in his book, The Rise of Colleges. There were beautiful endowments that were established for students, and Alwan Sharisi was asked by the head of a school in Fez in Morocco, what do we do with a student who's been with us and is not benefiting at all from the educational process, and yet he's on a scholarship? How long should we allow him to stay before we kick him out? And Alwan Sharisi's answer was, give him 10 years. And if he hasn't had an opening from God yet, teach him how to raise sheep or to do something useful. And I just thought that that was something, struck me about that was very profound. The idea that don't just assume people are uneducable. Don't just assume that they're stupid. Give them actual time, because just as we have different awakenings in our life, Our first awakenings are often sensual awakenings, to touch, to feel. We have aesthetic awakenings. We obviously have sexual awakenings. And these are very profound experiences as we grow. Some of us have spiritual awakenings, and some of us have intellectual awakenings. Just to give you an example of this, I was fortunate in participating in a small group discussion. We studied a book called Reforming Education, which was written by Mortimer Adler, and Adler was participating. He was more of an honorary head of this conference. But there was a young man there named John Allgood, and he told his story of how he came to become interested in learning. And what happened to him, he was a bricklayer, and one day a brick literally fell on his head from somebody who was working above him, and he was hospitalized, he was comatose. When he came to, somebody gave him a book called How to Read a Book by Adler and Van Doren. And he'd always had a hard time in school, which is one of the reasons why he became a bricklayer. There was a chapter that began, "You have a mind." And he said it was the first time anybody had ever told him that. And he had an intellectual awakening. And Malcolm X mentions this when he was in the 7th grade, and he told his teacher, when he asked him, "What do you want to be, Malcolm?" He was the only black kid in this school. And Malcolm said, "I want to be a lawyer." And the man said, "That's not a good job for a nigger. You should be something like a carpenter. You'll never succeed at that." And in some ways it was a benefit, because he probably would have become a brilliant lawyer. So the fact that that man deterred him from that, I think, is probably one of the reasons why we got Malcolm X, who in D&K's recent book, The 200 Most Important People in Human History, they actually had him in there because of his contribution to civil rights, which is one of the great events of certainly Western civilization. So we have these extraordinary awakenings. And one of the things that I realized in these schools is, one, they don't like to start the intellectual awakening too early. In the traditional school systems, they did not begin the educational process until the age of 7. And this is something that Rudolf Steiner predicted, that if you drop the age of education from 7 to 5, you will see that the cycle of a woman will begin earlier. So he related the biology taking place in a woman with the time that you start her intellectual development, because if you begin it too early, you're setting in motion something that has already been mapped out to occur in a very organized and developed pattern, because there's an unfolding that's taking place. You cannot hasten the unfolding of a flower. A flower knows when to bloom, how to bloom, and what you need to do, if anything, is just to provide the water if it's an indoor flower, and if it's outdoor, it'll take care of itself. So this is part of a deep wisdom that the ancients had, of knowing when to actually begin the process of education. And there is an extraordinary tradition from deeply wise human being Ali ibn Abi Talib, who said, play with your children for 7 years, and then teach them for 7 years, and then befriend them for 7 years, and then let them go. And that idea of playing with children for 7 years, this is what Piaget calls the play. What work is to the adult, play is to the child. That play is actually not insignificant, and that's why placing children into these advanced placement types of schools, where we start teaching them at 3 and 4 and 5 years things that they should be allowed to be relieved of, because they're in that Garden of Eden period, and you don't want to send them out before they bite the apple. Give them that time in that place of innocence. Another aspect of not educating children early is the importance of orality. As human beings, we are oral beings. One of the things that Mark Twain said is he obtained his education from uneducated people. And Thomas Jefferson says a similar thing. He says, the man that reads nothing is better educated than a man that reads only newspapers. because the man that doesn't read anything will actually think for himself. And people that only read newspapers often parrot what they've read in the newspapers, thinking that they're their own ideas. This idea of, during that period of time, to allow this child to develop at its own pace and not hastening this process is absolutely essential. And there's a deep wisdom in understanding the importance of orality. And this is where the idea of reading stories to children is so important. And we know that storytelling is an ancient human tradition. And everywhere you go, you will find that children are told stories, even in oral cultures. This is part of a deep educational process. What's very fascinating about children, and I learned this with my own children, and I didn't understand it until I read a book which I would really recommend. A is for Ox, Why Our Children Are Dying to Read. Barry Sanders, a really beautiful book. But what I would do when I would read my children stories at night, I would improvise, because you get a little tired of reading the same story over and over again, and they always want these same stories. They would get upset, and they would say, no, it's not like that. And I was really struck by this initially. Why are they doing this? And what Barry Sanders explains, this is important for them to hear the same thing over and over again, because this is the process of their development in order to acquire language, in order to acquire linear thought, in order to communicate intelligently. They need to be introduced into this, and they know how to do it. Just let them do it. And that's what we're so devastating at, is that we interrupt this process. And television is particularly pernicious. Not only does it give them different stories, it's giving them the visual images. Part of the development of the child is in imagination. And this is done through listening to stories and imagining in their minds what's taking place. There was a period of time when I would actually allow the boys to see these old films of books that they had to read first. And I remember they read, for instance, Seawolf, and then they saw the Edgar G. Robinson version of that, and I would ask them, what did you think? They said, the book was better. I didn't imagine he was like that. I imagined it like this. And this is because in reading the book, there was something else happening. And this is the activity that occurs with reading, which is why it is not a passive experience. It's a very active experience. Whereas television is a deeply passive experience, because not only are you hearing the story, but you're being given the emotions to experience. And the master of that is Steven Spielberg. I mean, I know just from the music what he wants you to feel at that point. He's even manipulating your emotions. He is not allowing you to experience something by yourself. He can pull those heartstrings, which is why he has such a mass impact on a society, because we have become a society that enjoys being manipulated by others, that we're losing our independence and our sovereign experience of the world. And this is another thing that the loss of imagination has. I want you just to think, for those of us who are older in this audience, the experience of falling in love. There are some people here that had a unique experience. There are other people, their experience was mediated by films that they've seen that taught them how to fall in love, that taught them how to say certain things at certain times. And so everybody experiences now lines, so that when somebody actually expresses their emotion or love, it's out of a movie. And so there's a jaded experience of the world, of that freshness of life. Children can be deprived of these experiences. So that was the first thing that really struck me. The second thing that really struck me is that in those first years, they did almost entirely memorization, because the children have extraordinary ability to amass knowledge, and there's a certain amount of knowledge that needs to be memorized. You have to memorize certain things. And many of the most successful people in careers in this society are people that were able to retain a lot more information. And we don't like to admit that. but that is actually the truth. Physicians are people that are often not more intelligent than other people, but they're in fact capable of memorizing a good deal of facts and figures and information. Much of chemistry, of biology, terminology, and then signs and symptoms. You have to learn certain things. When you see this, you see this. When you have these lab results, it indicates this. And it's true for all the medical professions, law also. And you have to memorize cases and know what happened in the past and be able to use analogically those things that happened in the past to make them relevant for situations going on in the present. What they did was they developed their capacity to memorize using very sophisticated techniques. And these were Bedouin that taught me how to use mnemonic devices. I'll never forget, there's 3 verses in the Quran that are almost identical. And I remember when I was learning these, he gave me this mnemonic device, Kalwafa, which began each one, how to do it. And then I asked him, do you do that with a lot of things? He said, almost everything that has any type of pattern or number system, and he began to show me how to do this. And these are very ancient techniques, and you can literally facilitate a child's process for adopting information by just teaching them very basic techniques that human beings have always known. And I'm amazed that these things are not taught early on in our schools to make so many things very simple for children. The next thing that I thought was very interesting is that they were very concerned about language skills, particularly the ability to diagram sentences. And the reason for that is because the ambiguous nature, particularly in Arabic, which is more so than English. The proof that we've got millions of people out there reading newspapers who know nothing about grammar is an indication that you can be functionally literate in English with having very little grammar. In Arabic, that is not the case because it's an inflected language. And if you don't know grammar, you don't know Arabic. It's impossible to learn classical Arabic without a knowledge of grammar. But grammar has another role, and what's very interesting about grammar is that grammar preserves a type of integrity in a language, and it also teaches us that there are rules that we need to abide by in order for there to be rational structures and meanings in our sentences. And one of the things about this postmodern idea that language is what people speak is really the quick route to reduce a people to people that are incapable of having discursive thought. And anybody that reads the people of the past, because the whole modern minimalist theory of language is to reduce everything down to simple sentences. Technical writing has become a standardized form of writing that is becoming the way that people now experience language, which reduces the capability of thought, because serious thought often takes deeper syntactical structures in expressing it. And learning how to do that is actually stimulating the intellect. There was a really interesting article recently, I think it's in this week's Newsweek, about the irrelevancy of poetry. And it was written by somebody who said, you know, poetry's meaningless now. And he talked about fast food culture and how he went through his poetry phase, but now he just didn't have time for poetry anymore. It was a very sad article for me to read, because I think what he was saying was, you know, why can't the poets just spell it out? Why do they have to make us think? Why won't they just say what they mean, as opposed to meaning what you say? Well, the poet is doing you a great service, because he's forcing you to go from the surface to something deeper, to go beyond the outward experience. And if education doesn't help that process, then it's not doing you any favors, because what you will be reduced to is a materialistic consumer. And yet everywhere there is expressions. One of the things that Rumi said is that the unseen is coming into the scene everywhere like cream in milk. It's everywhere. You have to be able to be open to that. And in our culture, we don't want to allow the cream to rise to the top. We want to homogenize. And that's part of this process. So the idea of teaching them how to analyze language. And this is why Mauritania, where I studied, is called Bilad Million Sha'ir. It's called the land of 1,000,000 poets. And they love poetry. And one of the things that I was really struck is that they have this response to poetry that I really enjoyed. If you would say a line of poetry, you would get this gut reaction, and several of the people in the gathering would say, "Ugh." They would make that sound, "Ugh." Because what you did is you embellished the experience, because poetry is beautiful when it's relevant. That's the power of poetry, is that it offers you insights into human experience. When a line of poetry is said in the right time, in the right place, with the right receptivity, it can literally ignite the atmosphere. And that's what I saw in these people, and they gave me a deep appreciation for that centrality of poetry in the human experience. And this is why it's always been around. And the fact that we're lamenting its loss is a deep sign. It's a deep sign of something that is really wrong with our culture and our society, when we're losing that capacity to hear the poet's voice. The poet is called in Arabic sha'ir, and it's related to, the Greek word is related to the same thing. The sha'ir is the one that feels things that other people don't perceive. It's a subtle, sha'r means hair. A laborer loses the ability for fine tactile stimulation. And the idea of the poet is that they can sense things that other people might not be sensing, but the beauty of the poet is he shares that with other people. And so he allows you to feel something that you might not have been able to feel, except that he was there to do it for you. And so he's a great gift in that way, or she is a great gift. Let's not forget Emily Dickinson. And then the embellishment of language, the importance of rhetoric in their system, which was the study of Western civilization for centuries. Rhetoric is the means by which you coerce people without force. And that is why it is the hallmark of civilization. What our society teaches us now is that might makes right. What the ancients understood, that if words can be used in the absence of swords, then that was the way always to go. But words must be meaningful, powerful, and coercive. But because they're such dangerous tools, words, they're subversive and they're dangerous, and that's why they're so feared by certain elements in our society. Winston Churchill said that rhetoricians and orators have a power that kings don't possess, because kings can only move armies with sovereign force, with their power. But orators can actually move people with speech. And obviously we've seen the worst of it in people like Hitler, who mobilized an entire society with the rhetoric of evil. And that's why there is something very dangerous about it, and something frightening. But if you have an educated population, and this is one of the hallmarks of early American society, is that they were an argumentative culture. People would go out to see Lincoln and Douglas debate for 3 hours on a sunny day, and they were engaged in that debate. They knew the issues. And most of them who were educated had studied what are called the mughalatat. I studied it in Arabic, but in English we call it the sophistical tradition, using sophistical reasoning, so that there are certain techniques that sophists learn, and lawyers master these techniques. Arguments, the use of sophistical reasoning, logical fallacies that can be very powerful when manipulated. But if you're taught how to recognize them, then you gain an immunity. You have antibodies against them. And so you're able to think and see that the reasoning is flawed. And that was the third element in this trivium or triad of arts. In English, arts comes from the same Latin root as army. Ars was power. And that's what art is. It's power. And the artist, whether it's a visual artist or a writer, they have a power. That is the power of civilized strength, not of barbaric strength, not the strength of numbers, not the strength of military might, but the strength of reason, of thought, of insight. People have them to a certain extent naturally. And what the arts do is that they enhance them. They refine them. They hone them down. And that's what schooling should be, a refining. Our word in English for education, education is from educare, in Latin meant to lead out. There's two ideas embedded in that, and probably more, but I can see two. One of them is the idea that a child already has the kernel of everything in it. And what you do is you help facilitate that by leading that knowledge out of the child that's already there. And the way I was taught in the East was we studied in a circle, which is very different from the lecture, where I have the knowledge and you're all ignorant, and I impart it out of my largesse and magnanimity to all of you. And that is this idea of the lecture, the doctor, the one that can teach, docere, and it becomes il duce. That's what they called Mussolini. Same root word. The doctor becomes the tyrant whose authority is unchallengeable. So this idea of having a circle as opposed to having a linear, recognizing that secret of the circle, and that the teacher of the arts is in that circle, and the circle returns back to him. That idea of giving them these arts, these powers. Now, in the classical education, there were certain other arts that were the mathematical arts or the arts of number in both the West and in the classical Arabic tradition and Persian and Turkish. Those were arithmetic, geometry. The Muslims developed algebra and trigonometry for very specific religious reasons, interestingly enough. Algebra was designed to work out inheritance, and spherical trigonometry was actually designed to get the fastest way to Mecca because of the spherical curve of the earth. And if you're interested in that, David King wrote an entire book on the subject, who's a brilliant historian of science in Germany. And then music, which in the Muslim world was an extraordinary science based on a cosmology. Unfortunately, there's not much on this in English. There's extraordinary work in Arabic. The classical text of Al-Farabi, one of the great philosophers of the Arabian tradition, who wrote a book called Kitab al-Musiq al-Kabir, the big music book. Hamza Alauddin, I don't know if people are familiar with him, he's a brilliant oud player. He actually gave me his copy, and it is the big music book. It's about 2,000 pages. And Hamza has a knowledge of that. And if you go on his website, he's got some insights into the secrets that they discovered about music. One of the reasons that music is so dangerous, Plato wanted it banished from the Republic, the musicians. And the reason for that is not that he didn't enjoy music, because the gymnasia was actually, musica was what they taught their children. But he felt that most musicians didn't know what they were doing. And what they could do to the soul was so dangerous because of the nature of the power of music, the impact that it can have on the soul, and that in the hands of somebody that didn't know what they were doing or manipulated it for other means, that he felt it was better just to keep it away. Now, in the Muslim tradition, they separated the profane and the sacred music. And many of the scholars prohibited the profane music because they felt that it did have a bad impact on people. And the sacred music, they developed a cosmology. To this day in Turkey, there is a man there who has a hospital where they still use traditional music therapy, which was developed in Persia, because the Arab music has a 24-note system as opposed to a 12, because they bring in quarter notes. And it's related to the 12 hours of the day. Out of 12 organs in the body, they have 12 in their system. There are 2 hours, and this is the same as the Chinese system and the Ayurvedic system. They have 2 hours that are related. So heart is between 9 and 11 o'clock. in the morning. So if you want to work on the heart, then that was the time that for people that had problems with their heart, you would play certain chromatic scales that were designed to actually strengthen the heart during that period. And in Andalusia, they had insane asylums in which orchestras were actually retained to treat the mad people by playing music to them. And these musicians were master musicians that they would base it on the pulse and base it on this humoral theory, because melancholia is from one of the four humors, the out of balance of that. So they would try to reestablish this, and they did have success. If you read their books and believe what they're saying, they had extraordinary success with this. The culmination of this second part of these arts was astronomy. And I was very fortunate in living in West Africa, because that is one of the few places where they still teach sacred astronomy. And again, these are Bedouin that I was introduced into the rudiments of sacred astronomy, which is the observation of the order of the heavens. And watching that order and understanding, for instance, like right now the moon is in Leo. If you go out tonight and you see the constellation Leo, which is a stunning constellation that can actually be seen in this area, the moon is in Leo right now, and it will be in Leo for 2 1/3 days, and then it moves. And this is not related to astrology, although it was used for astrology as well, and there were many astrologers. But this is not astrology. It's observing these lunar mansions. There are 28 lunar mansions that the moon goes through every month, because the moon does around the earth what the sun does. The experience of the sun in a year, the moon does in a month. And there is a correlation between these movements, all based on 360 degrees and related to this secret of the circle. I mean, this is very deep order that people were introduced to in these traditional cosmologies that are found all over the planet. I mean, this is not something that is simply found in West Africa. This was also found in India, it was found in Central Asia, it was found in Asia, it was found in Europe, and it was certainly found here. I mean, we have extraordinary evidence here of the Native American Indians that were heavily involved in sacred astronomy and aligning the heavens and the earth. And this is part of the sacred tradition of the ancient Greek idea, the Pythagorean idea of as above, so below. That in observing the order of the heavens, and this is what Plato says is the greatest gift of the stars, is that they enable us to see order and in turn desire that order in our own souls. And so this is at the root of a classical understanding of education, was how do we order ourselves that we are in harmony with the world? Because everything out there seems to be in an extraordinary harmony, and it is the human being that seems so adept at being disorderly, at being chaotic, at being out of sync with the world. And Wordsworth's poem is a complaint about that we're out of sync with nature, that we've lost that ability, and he preferred being a pagan that could see that order and experience it than to have a creed that divorced him from that. I want to finish here with two things, and then I'll close up. A couple of quotes about education. Education's a perennial problem. It always has been. Will Rogers said, schools ain't what they used to be, and they never was. So it is an ancient problem. People have been complaining about it for a long time. Mark Twain said that first God invented idiots for practice, and then he invented school boards. There's some really extraordinary things that have been said about education. Alexander Dumas remarked, how is it that little children are so intelligent and men are so stupid? It must be education. Robert Frost defined education. I think this is the best thing that I've seen, and that's why I wanted to comment on it a little bit. Education is the ability to listen to almost anything without losing your temper or self-confidence. And I would say that is a civilized human being. And so ultimately, if I have an illiterate person that's able to do that, I would consider them educated. And that's why I personally do not equate education with literacy. I really don't. Some of the most intelligent people I've ever met were illiterates. If you want to know the whole American foreign policy, it was summed up to me by a Bedouin from Yemen who absolutely had no education. And he said, you know what the problem with your country is? And I said, what? He said, it's like a story we have in Yemen about a wolf that came down to a pond, and he saw a sheep about to drink from the pond, and he said, I'm going to eat you. And the sheep said, what did I ever do to you? He said, you mucked up my pond. He said, I haven't even touched it yet. He said, well, you did it last year. I wasn't born last year. Well, your father mucked it up. That's basically what he said. That's America. I want to give you another good example. We can get rid of all the environmentalists and all the UNESCO and all these United Nations councils on saving the environment and employ a deaf, illiterate man that I met in West Africa, who one of the Western students was there, and he wanted to build a tent, because I lived in what's called a house. You go out and you get branches and you set them up, and then you sew up burlap sacks and then make your little house. And that was student housing that I lived in. And this young Western student started to chop down a tree. And this illiterate slave, really from a group of people that were traditionally slaves in Mauritania, illiterate, he came up and he said, don't do that, what are you doing? He said, I was going to chop it off to make a hosh. He said, no, you don't do that. Just take a branch and go from another tree and take another branch. Don't chop down the tree. He said, you have a right in the tree, but the tree has rights with you. Don't take the tree away, because there's animals that benefit from that tree. There's people that sit under the shade. And that's how he explained it to this young Western person who just thought, I'll just chop the tree down. Well, that's somebody who's lived in an environment that understands that natural resources are limited. Trees are limited in West Africa. And that's what he taught that young man. And that's an immense lesson to learn. Take what you need, but don't destroy. There's plenty to go around. Very simple lesson. So, in learning how to listen without losing our temper or our self-confidence is to really, I think, become educated. And the Arabs have a beautiful word for intellect, which is hilm. And this word, in its root meaning, is to suck milk. The breast in Arabic is halama, and it comes from the same root. It's to take milk from the mother. And the reason that they use that is because hilm is an unperturbed state. It is the state a child is in when it is suckling. And the word for intellect is the same word. Intellect is to be unperturbed, to be in a state in which you can make sense of your world, even in the midst of immense chaos, immense calamity, that you maintain that unperturbed state because you've been given this incredible gift of intellect, of reason, that losing your state, like Chicken Little, that state of the sky is falling, the sky is falling, of losing that is to lose your sanity. And sanity is another beautiful word which means health. I mean, that is a sane human being, is a healthy human being. And so at the root is learning how to listen to others, to absorb the ideas of others, to recognize that you don't know everything, that I don't know everything, that this is give and take. The children have as much to teach us as we have to teach them, because they've remembered things that we've forgotten. And that's why their world is so extraordinary. It has immense things to offer us. And one of the things that I do with my children as a practice, sometimes my children will come in and say, you have to see this, you have to see this. And I try to force myself to get into the same state they're in and say, what? And they said, this bug. And then we both run outside and they show me, look, and oh my God, that's the most extraordinary thing. And I want to be in that state. I want to experience the world with those new eyes, because it's all new. You know, I hate when you ask people how things going, same old, same old. What are you talking about? Your cells have been replicated in the last 3 months. You don't even exist. The same person I saw 3 months ago doesn't even exist. They're gone. The physical being is completely renewed. It's all new. And that newness of life, that is what children have. And that's what our educational system robs from them, destroys, losing that excitement about learning. The word in Arabic, to find something, means to become ecstatic, wajada. Ecstatic in Latin, ecstasis, to come out of the self. And that is what education is about, is losing the self. Eureka. I mean, we have that in our tradition, eureka. And the story is that he was so excited, he ran down the street naked, shouting eureka, eureka, because he discovered something extraordinary about the physical universe. And those discoveries about the physical universe are hors d'oeuvres for what we discover about the metaphysical world, really. And they're both there for the taking, and I would really like just to see our children be allowed to retain that innocence and that power and that desire to know that's so deeply embedded in every cell in their body. Thank you very much.